The air in the back of the yard's neighborhood always tasted faintly of copper and ash, a sensory tax levied by the sprawling Union stockyards that defined the district's existence. But tonight, inside the cramped Bregovy apartment, the air smelled of heated iron and cheap floral talcum powder. It was Friday night in the depth of the Great Depression, a time when joy was rationed as strictly as sugar. For 21-year-old Mary Bregovy, however, tonight was an escape hatch. She stood before a cracked mirror in the bedroom she shared with her sisters, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. It wasn't silk real. Silk was a fantasy for a factory girl supporting a family. But in the dim lamplight, the white rayon shimmered with enough promise to fool anyone, herself included. It was her dancing armor. Her dark hair, not blonde as the later whispers would claim, was pin-curled tightly against her skull. A practical style meant to survive hours of swing dancing without wilting. Her eyes, bright and eager, scanned her reflection for imperfections. She looked older than her years. The factory shifts had seen to that, etching faint lines around her mouth that only truly relaxed when music was playing. Outside, the wind whipped down the narrow gangways between the two flat buildings, rattling the loose window pane. Chicago was thawing from a brutal winter, and the streets were a slick mess of melting slush and industrial grime. Mary didn't care about the cold. The heat of anticipation radiating from her chest was enough to ward off a blizzard. Tonight was about movement, about noise, about forgetting the tedious rhythm of the assembly line and replacing it with the brassy shout of a jazz orchestra. She applied a dangerous amount of red lipstick, a defiant splash of color against the pervasive gray of her world. She was going out. She was going to live, if only until the music stopped. The car ride away from the suffocating closeness of the neighborhood felt like a jailbreak. Mary was crammed into the back seat of a rattling sedan with friends, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the cheap gin someone had managed to procure. They were heading toward the light, away from the stockyards and toward the places where Chicago pretended the depression wasn't happening. The route took them toward the deeper city. They navigated streets that were less roads and more industrial canyons. Warehouses loomed like dark cliffs on either side, their windows boarded up or staring blankly with soot-stained glass. The city lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red against the wet pavement. Mary pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the city spowl past. She felt a strange detachment, a sense of floating between the hard reality of her daily life and the shimmering potential of the night ahead. The car hit a pothole, jarring her spine, and the laughter inside the vehicle spiked, a nervous energy that needed release. They were young, they were broke, and they were desperate for a few hours where tomorrow didn't matter. The city groaned around them, a massive machine briefly pausing its gears, allowing these few sparks of humanity to pass through toward the music. The destination wasn't the famous ballrooms far out on Archer just yet. The night was starting closer to the city's heart. Stepping out of the car, the sound hit Mary before she even reached the doors, the thumping bass drum, acting like a second heartbeat, beckoning her forward. The air inside the dance hall was hot, humid, and smelled intensely of sweat, perfume, and bootleg alcohol. It was glorious. Under the spinning lights, the depression evaporated. The wooden floor quaked under hundreds of feet moving in synchronized chaos. Mary didn't just walk onto the floor, she erupted onto it. When the band struck up a fast-tempo swing number, she allowed herself to be pulled into the orbit of a partner. For hours, she was pure kinetic energy. The white dress spun like a dervish, a beacon in the smoky room. She laughed, throwing her head back, her dark curls breaking free of their pins. This was where she belonged in motion. Surrounded by noise so loud it drowned out the worries of rent and food. Every spin was an act of defiance against the bleak world outside. She was Mary Bregovy, and tonight, she was alive. The details of why they left, and why they headed toward the loop instead of back home to the south side, were lost in the haze of the night's end. Perhaps it was a desire to keep the party going, a refusal to let the dawn bring reality back too soon. Mary found herself in another car, this one driven with a reckless abandon that matched the hour. They were in downtown Chicago now. The towering skyscrapers, usually monuments to commerce, stood like silent tombstones in the dead of night. The streets near the Chicago River were slick with an icy rain that had begun to fall. The car was moving too fast. The laughter had died down, replaced by the hypnotic hum of the engine and the rhythm of windshield wipers batting away the sleet. Mary felt a sudden, chilling premonition settle over her. A coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. They approached the intersection of Lake Street and Wacker Drive, a complex tangle of iron supports for the elevated trains and the heavy concrete of the multi-level streets. The driver misjudged the curve. The tires lost their grip on the wet pavement. The world outside the window dissolved into a sickening spin. There was no time to scream, only a sharp intake of breath as the heavy sedan slid uncontrollably toward a massive concrete stanchion supporting the roadway above. The impact was catastrophic. The sound of tearing metal and shattering glass echoed briefly against the stone canyons of the loop, before being swallowed by the city's silence. Then, there was nothing. For Mary, the transition wasn't a fade into darkness, but a sudden, violent dislocation. One moment she was in the back seat, terrified. The next, she was standing on the wet pavement of Wacker Drive, looking at the steaming wreckage of the car. She felt no pain. She looked down at her white dress. It was pristine, untouched by the blood and oil that stained the street. Confusion washed over her. She saw the arrival of the police cars, the flashing lights painting the wet concrete in frantic reds. She saw them pull bodies from the wreck. She saw her own face, pale and still, being covered by a tarp. She tried to shout, to tell them she was standing right there. But the sound died in her throat, unheard by the living. A profound, soul-shattering loneliness engulfed her. She wasn't meant to end here, in this cold canyon of concrete in the loop. She needed to go home. She needed to go back to the south side. The geographical confusion that would fuel the legend began. Hear her spirit, tethered to the trauma of her death, yearning for the familiar route home that she never got to take. The funeral was a blur of weeping relatives and the oppressive smell of incense in the polish. Catholic Church. Mary watched it all from a distance, a bewildered spectator at her own final rites. They took her body far from the grime of the back of the yards, out past the city limits to Justice, Illinois. They buried her in Resurrection Cemetery, a vast expanse of consecrated ground located at 7201 Archer Road. It was a cold March day when they lowered her into the earth. Because money was scarce, there was no headstone placed to mark her final resting place. She was an unmarked ripple in a sea of grass and soil. As the mourners left, driving away down the long stretch of Archer Avenue back toward the city, Mary's spirit remained. She was tethered to this soil, yet desperately unhappy with the finality of it. She was 21. She hadn't finished dancing. The injustice of it burned colder than the grave. She began to walk the perimeter of the cemetery, gazing out at the asphalt ribbon of Archer Avenue, the road that connected the quiet of the dead to the vibrant noise of the living city she missed so terribly. 5 years passed, the Depression waned, and war loomed in Europe. The memory of Mary Bregovy had faded for all but her immediate family. But along Archer Avenue, something new was growing in the dark. It started in the taverns and dance halls that lined the road. Places like the O. Henry Ballroom. Late-night patrons, their judgment clouded by drink and fatigue, began to share strange stories. A delivery driver, shaking as he nursed a whiskey, told of seeing a girl walking on the gravel shoulder, near the woods between the ballroom and the cemetery. It was freezing out, he said, but she wore only a thin white party dress. When he slowed down to offer help, the headlights caught only empty air and swirling dust. These stories were dismissed as drunken hallucinations initially, but they persisted. The descriptions became eerily uniform. A young woman. Blonde memory is a fickle artist, often painting over the truth with brighter colors. Blue-eyed dressed for a party that ended years ago. The legend was just feeding on the inherent creepiness of the unlit stretch of road, waiting for the right moment to step fully into the headlights. Decades later, Archer Avenue remained a dark artery, connecting the southwest suburbs to Chicago. It was late October, 1978. The air was crisp and smelled of fallen oak leaves and impending winter. Frank, a salesman exhausted from a 3-day trip to downstate Illinois, just wanted to get home to his bed in Berwyn. His Buick LeSabre hummed along the 4-lane road. This stretch of Archer, heavily wooded on both sides as it cut through the forest preserves, always unnerved him. The streetlights were sparse, casting isolated pools of yellow illumination, separated by long stretches of profound darkness. The radio faded in and out, static chewing up the late-night talk show he was trying to listen to. He passed the sprawling complex of the Willowbrook Ballroom, formerly the O. Henry, its parking lot largely empty at 2 a.m. He rubbed his eyes, fighting highway hypnosis. The road ahead was a tunnel of black trees. He checked his speedometer, eager to put this desolate stretch behind him. A shallow ground fog had begun to rise from the damp forest floor, clinging to the edges of the asphalt like spectral fingers. Frank squinted. Ahead, perhaps 100 yards on the right shoulder, something pale stood out against the unrelenting black wall of the woods. As he closed the distance, the shape resolved into a person. It was a woman. She was standing perfectly still, dangerously close to the traffic lane. She wasn't hitchhiking in the traditional sense. Her thumb wasn't out. She just stood there, waiting. Frank's foot hovered over the brake. His instinct was to keep. Driving it was dangerous to pick up strangers in the late 70s, but something about her posture, something about the sheer vulnerability of her presence in the freezing fog, struck a chord of paternal worry in him. She looked like she was dressed for a prom in the 1950s. Not a cold October night in 78. Her white dress hung limply, soaked by the mist. They were crossing into the border of Justice, Illinois. The landscape opened up slightly. The passenger suddenly shifted in her seat. It was the first voluntary movement she'd made since getting in. She raised a pale arm and pointed a slender finger toward the windshield. "There," she whispered. The word carried an intense weight of sadness and longing. "I have to stop there." Frank peered ahead. There were no houses, no side streets. Ahead, looming on the right side of the road, were the large stone gates and wrought iron fencing of a massive cemetery. The sign, illuminated by a lone streetlight, read, "Resurrection Cemetery, 7201 Archer Road." "The cemetery?" Frank asked, confused. "You live here?" "Please stop," she insisted, her voice gaining a sudden, desperate urgency. Frank slowed the Buick, pulling onto the wide gravel apron right in front of the main gates of Resurrection Cemetery. The heavy iron gates were locked tight for the night, the bronze bars gleaming dully in the headlights. He put the car in park and turned to the girl, ready to ask her what was going on, why she wanted to be dropped off at a graveyard at 2:30 in the morning. "Look, miss, I can't just leave you." The words died in his mouth. The passenger seat was empty. Frank blinked, his brain refusing to process the visual information. He whipped his head around, looking into the back seat. Empty. He looked at the door. The lock was still depressed. It hadn't opened. There had been no sound of a latch clicking, no rush of cold air. She was simply gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Frank's chest. He scrambled out of the car, nearly tripping on the gravel. He ran around to the passenger side and yanked the door open, frantically searching the floorboards, as if a full-grown woman could have somehow compressed herself. Under the dash, nothing. He looked at the cemetery gates. They were sealed with a heavy chain and padlock. Beyond the bars, the endless rows of headstones stood silent under the moonlight. Frank leaned back into the car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached out to touch the passenger seat where she had been sitting seconds ago. The vinyl was ice cold to the touch, and there, faintly damp against the upholstery, was the unmistakable outline of where someone in a wet dress had been sitting. The smell of damp earth and dried roses lingered heavily in the air. Frank never drove down that stretch of Archer Avenue at night again. He became one of the dozens, perhaps hundreds, who added their testimony to the legend. He had met Resurrection Mary, back within the confines of the cemetery fences. The spirit that had once been Mary Bregovy felt the crushing weight of the return. The brief ride, the tantalizing proximity to the world of the living, had ended as it always Did that, the gates of 7201. Archer wrote the geographical confusion that had begun in the loop in 1934 continued to haunt her death. She sought the familiar, trying to get home to the back of the yards, but her spirit was inexorably pulled back to the place her body rested. As Frank's taillights faded into the distance, the figure in white stood inside the gates, gripping the cold bronze bars. Some say if you look closely at those bars today, you can still see the discoloration scorch marks, where her burning frustration and longing to return to the dance seared the metal. The night was silent again, save for the wind through the trees, whispering the name that history had forgotten, but folklore would remember forever.